You are listening to the Antler and Featherco podcast. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Antler and Featherco podcast, the podcast for new and adult onset hunters. My name's Vince, and I'm a newer hunter who's on a mission to learn absolutely everything I can about this wonderful thing we call hunting. And as I learn, I want to just pass it right along to you guys. So today's show is going to be the first of a handful of podcasts focused specifically on arrows. We're going to talk about heavy arrows, light arrows, and the happy medium that I think can be achieved when we're talking specifically about hunting whitetails. I want to start by setting some ground rules. This is going to be factual, data-driven conversation. There's not going to be any bashing for the sake of bashing. We're not going to call you an idiot for shooting light. We're not going to call you an idiot for shooting heavy. The goal is to bring the hunting community closer on this subject, not divide it further apart. So with that said, I think whenever there's a topic to be debated, it's extremely important for both sides to fully understand the opposing side's argument. All too often we fall into headline arguments where we're arguing about two headlines that we don't really know anything about. Specifically when it comes to arrows, oftentimes I find people choosing a side, digging their hole, and then dying in that hole without even being able to define FOC, kinetic energy, momentum, spine, broadhead efficiency, etc. I think people's ideas of heavy and light arrows are grossly exaggerated in many cases, and I think when people hear the term heavy arrow, they assume someone's shooting a 700 grain broom handle at an animal, while when people hear light arrows, they tend to assume the opposite, a 350 grain toothpick that isn't going to do anything. Most people that I've talked to and researched, both on the pro and amateur side, I think are actually a lot closer to each other than they're not. I recall hearing guys like John Dudley talking about shooting a 500 plus grain arrow, referencing FOC. I've heard Cam Haynes shooting mid 500 arrow with an iron will 2-blade fixed blade broadhead, and the list goes on. No one would condemn either of those guys for shooting the setups that they're shooting. But if it wasn't John and it wasn't Cam, I feel like the debate would sizzle. 550 grains is either too heavy or not heavy enough. And the funny thing is, I think they fall within that happy medium that I referenced earlier. So now that all that's out of the way, let's get to today's guests. Joining me today is the co-founder and president of the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation, Rob Neilson, and Ashby Bowhunting Foundation Director, Rob Hummel. Hey guys, how are we doing today?
Awesome.
Good.
Appreciate you having us on.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to have you guys on. You guys are a wealth of knowledge, and I wanted to have you guys on the show for a number of reasons. First, I want to give everyone an accurate depiction of what the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation is and does. I think many times it gets labeled kind of as an ultra-heavy arrow, my way or the highway organization that is basically anti-anything that isn't a 900 grain arrow, shooting a single bevel broadhead, and that's simply not true. So I want to start off by talking about what the foundation actually is about. Secondly, I want to discuss the benefits of heavier arrow systems in terms of arrow lethality and why you guys have found that generally a heavier arrow is the way to go. Again, understanding that heavy arrow does not always mean 650 grains plus. So that's kind of the direction we're going to go. I always start off with a prayer, so I'm going to say a prayer real quick, and then we'll hop into who you guys are, what you do, and then we'll talk about what the foundation does. From that point, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of heavier arrow systems. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right.
Good.
Lord, I thank you for today. I thank you for just another opportunity to record with some amazing guests. Overall, I thank you for Jesus. I thank you for what he did on the cross in our place. I would not be sitting here with the freedoms to do the things that I do, to have a relationship with you without what Jesus did for me. So above all, I thank you for that. I want to use this podcast as a way to glorify you overall. I thank you for Rob and Rob. I thank you that you put them in my life and that they're willing to come on here and share their information. They're willing to take time on the weekend to share time with me to talk about a heavily debated topic. And I just ask that you would be over this conversation. You'd make it entertaining, full of education for everyone that's listening. And we just ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, guys. So starting with Rob Neilson,
Yep.
explain to everybody who you are and what your role is with the Ashby Foundation.
Okay. I've been bow hunting over 40 years, so quite a long time. And I got into it when I was 13 years old. When I first got into it, I mean, it was basically a handful of us in this small hometown of Mississippi where we grew up, and we knew nothing about archery, but we got into it, just bought stuff over the counter, went hunting, had a great time. Everything worked up until a certain point, killing animals cleanly, all the way up until I would say the light and fast craze kicked in. And then of course I jumped on that bandwagon, and it was like, okay, then bows and arrows started vibrating, louder, everything. I started, had a handful of broadhead failures, arrow failures, just basically the arrows exploding on impact. And that made me jump down this rabbit hole that I'm on now. And it's like, okay, wait a minute, everything worked before, but now I've shifted over here to this, what everybody's telling me to use, and nothing's working. And and that was going from the old aluminum heavy arrow shafts. I didn't even own a scale, so I had no earthly idea what, this arrow is 580 grains, 600 grains. But I have actually gone back and weighed my old arrow systems, and they were right at 600 grains total weight, and it all worked. But going into the light and fast craze, I was probably heavy for the light and fast craze in the about 470. And but it still, the arrows just didn't work for what I was hunting. And that's gravitated me to start research, and I found Dr. Ashby's studies, and I was like, started reading. It's like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. And I took it a step farther. I actually found Dr. Ashby, and here I am right now as the co-founder and president of the foundation. But in my background is my professional background. I'm in the oil and gas industry, and I started off in quality assurance, quality control. So either something is built correctly or it's not built correctly. It's in spec or out of spec. And so I basically look at things with a pretty critical eye, the arrows, the broadheads, everything, and kind of, we geek out over this stuff. There's no doubt about it. So but anyway, in 2017, that's when we decided, okay, we've got all these studies, let's get this into a foundation, and an education, a science and education based foundation. And so that's when we started up the foundation. Basically it's, Dr. Ashby, as we know, everything he's done has benefited bow hunters worldwide for decades. And one of our goals is to basically make available all this information to help achieve the highest possible success rate and reduce the wounding and non-recovery rate of game animals to the lowest level possible, no matter what someone's hunting. Okay. Basically, Dr. Ashby did the Natal study in 1985, and building on that, that was the definitive document that resulted in the first law to affirmatively legalize bow hunting in Africa. It's the database spans over 30 years, 118 data points per shot. And from that data, that's where the 12 penetration enhancing factors were derived. Okay. In addition to that 30 years of research, we've got an additional 20 plus years of data utilizing these penetration enhanced arrow systems in real hunting situations, which it accounts for clean kills on over 100 elephant, over 2,000 Cape Asiatic buffalo, and multitudes of game animals all around the globe. And it all strongly validates this research. Okay. Today, we took the original database and updated it. Basically, there was a lot of equipment that was not available to Doc at the time that he did his original database. And now we have over 250 data points per arrow shot in our current database. And we've got 2 years of information that we've plugged into that so far. And it's going to be around 25,000 data points that we've got recorded in this database so far. So yeah, and nobody else, to our knowledge, has this type of information. gun or bow. You got people out doing other testing and stuff in medium other than animals, but you really need to be testing these arrows and broadheads in these animals, because there is no substitute for an animal. So, and that's why we do what we do. And so, yeah, it's basically to help bow hunters worldwide, no matter what they're hunting, whether they're hunting just whitetails, pigs here in the States, or squirrels, turkey, or if they're pursuing large game, larger game. So elk out west, going after bear, caribou, things like that. So, or traveling international and hunting. So,
all right. And Rob Hummel, tell everybody who you are and what you do with the foundation.
So I came on as a director at the start of 2022. Been involved with most of the team for quite a few years. That's actually, I'll say a late bloomer. No one in my family bow hunts. And I got into it shortly after I met my wife. And her family bow hunted. I've always been interested, got into it, and immediately started questioning things. And I guess I have engineering background. I have electromechanical background, so both controls and mechanics. And it was like I went with off the shelf pro shop recommended type setup and was seeing flight issues and other challenges, and started doing my own research. And lucky for me, I ended up connecting with one of the other now directors, and kind of got pointed to some of the reports and dove in and went, all right, like, this is my language. Like, I talk physics, I talk numbers, like, give me data. And all clicked, went out, put a system together, worked great. And since then have been playing with and testing a whole variety of things all across the board. And that's in the last like 12 years have helped run one shop, had my own shop, and now I focus my time working with the foundation, doing events, seminars, writing articles, podcasts, just helping spread the word and get it out there.
Good deal. So starting with the foundation, one thing I wanted to address with you guys, just for people before we get deep into things, tell me about kind of the basic message coming from the foundation. Like we talked about earlier, I think a lot of people, when they hear heavy arrows or they hear the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation, their assumption is everything you guys tell people to do with their arrow systems, it has to be at least 650 grains. It has to be a 2-blade single bevel broadhead. It has to be this, and this. Another big one I hear is, hey, everything they do, it's great, but it only matters to low poundage traditional bow systems. And I think there's a lot of, I don't want to use this term because I hate it over the last 2 years, but I think there's a lot of misinformation about what the foundation is actually standing for. So could one of you guys kind of explain a little of what we talked about on your position with the heavy arrow thing? What is a acceptable grain amount per arrow that you guys talk about? And I'm setting you up a little bit with that question, but
No,
go ahead and take that.
No, that's fine. I mean, we've got a recommended chart out there by game animal. And that's always our first question. What are you hunting? And, then go from there. And we try to get people into the most efficient systems that will work for their setup, whether it's a 40-pound bow or a 70-pound bow, it does not matter. We basically, that's our goal, is for them to have the most efficient arrow system, because the first thing that contacts that animal is that broadhead and then that arrow. I mean, that's what connects you to that animal. So that's the most important thing, to get that animal killed quickly and down and not wound them, and they run off and you can't find them. And then that person continues to hunt because they did not find that wounded animal, but then ultimately he kills another animal, or she, and then you have 2 dead animals versus 1. So yeah, we just want to try to bring the wound loss rates down, educate people to use the most efficient systems that they can use, see through all the marketing hype out there, because there obviously is a lot of marketing hype and nobody is checking it at all. So that's really what we do. And then as far as the heavy arrows, it's no, there's nowhere on our website that says you must shoot this grain arrow or that grain arrow for anything. There's like, there's seriously reading comprehension issues out there. It's blasted all over our website. And we've got directors that shoot sub 550 grain arrows. So, and that's what they are comfortable with, the trajectory that their arrow systems and their bows give them. And so there's multiple directors that shoot sub 650 grain arrows. I'm probably one of the exceptions. I'm kind of I call myself a lazy bow hunter. I set up one bow, one arrow system, and I use it for everything, no matter what. And case in point, I was in Zambia in June doing testing, and I was hunting anything from impala, which are 80, 90 pound animals, to Livingston eland, which are over 2,000 pound animals. So I needed an arrow system to kill that animal, that if it'll take out the Livingston eland, it'll take out an impala. And it did. It worked fine. So yeah, and coming back to the US here, I'm just returned from Wyoming on a pronghorn hunt. And yes, I use the same arrow system that I used in Africa because it works. And I am comfortable with that trajectory. And I can promise you in that pronghorn camp, my son and myself, we were probably the 2 heaviest arrow shooters in that group, because I built him up his system so he could hunt Western game, hunt elk and things like that. And he basically said, I'm going to use the same system. I don't want to, and there's nothing wrong with people using multiple arrow systems for various game. I just choose to use one, and I'm intimately familiar with my trajectory. There's I think another, I guess, misunderstanding about accuracy and trajectory. And it's like, okay, if I'm used to my trajectory, that doesn't make my arrow less accurate because it's got more of a trajectory on it. So I'm used to it. I'm putting my arrow where it needs to go. And that's what matters. And getting your arrow there, the accuracy part is a given to me in the hunting world. You've got to get it there. But then what happens when that arrow makes impact to that mud caked hog? You've got mud to get through, you've got hair, hide, muscle, sinew, bone. I mean, so what happens to that arrow? We really look at what happens to that arrow system when it makes impact through that animal. And can it get through that animal? Does it have enough inertia from the bow that the bow is going to launch the arrow at what it launches it at, period. But does that arrow have enough inertia, enough momentum to actually get through that animal and kill it cleanly? So we're really more about education, but no, we're not going to sit here and tell someone you must shoot this arrow system, you must shoot that. And even on our chart, we've set up some people that what we would call on certain categories of animals. I think it was in the C category, and it worked fine. And so it's just a matter of what trajectory are those people comfortable with. So, and that's kind of what we look at, and okay, let's utilize the most efficient systems that you can. So
it seems like, you guys are mostly focused on, as you just said, creating the most efficient arrow system in terms of lethality. I think a lot of people get confused that what I'd like on a basic level for one of you guys to kind of explain is there are a lot of factors that go into making that arrow more lethal, more efficient. If you guys get on the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation's website, you'll see that Dr. Ashby has the 12 factors. Without going into each individual factor, there are a lot of things that go into making that arrow more lethal. So like I said earlier, I think people don't really understand what FOC actually is. I don't think they understand what the function of energy is. I think kinetic energy has been kind of bastardized. People want to say, my bow is a kinetic energy machine, but they don't understand how energy works in terms of, transfer of energy. What is kinetic energy? I think it's just a blanket term that people throw out there that think it means I have a faster arrow. Could you guys, one of you guys, kind of explain briefly what FOC is and how it applies to an arrow, what kinetic energy is, and then what momentum is, and how do those actually apply to an efficient arrow, so that people, when they want to argue, I have a kinetic energy machine, oh, momentum's the most important thing, maybe they can actually understand what those actually mean when they get into a debate.
So first was FOC, right? So FOC is weight forward of center, which is simply a reference point for the arrow's center of gravity. So we are referencing the physical center of the shaft compared to its center of gravity. So if you take your arrow, balance it on your finger, balance it on a knife, whatever you have available, right? You'll see that in the vast majority of cases, the balance point is somewhere ahead of that center. Now, what that changes is some aerodynamic properties and the stability of that shaft in flight. So if we think about airplanes, like a 747 is very nose heavy. It's very stable, but it takes a lot to turn it, right? It takes a lot to get it to bank and to redirect. Now, like an F-16 has no front of center. It is extremely agile, extremely nimble, to the point that it needs, you can't fly it purely with a pilot. It's very computer assisted because it's so unstable that you need help, but it can flip on a dime.
Right.
And so that's the big thing, is the further forward that balance point gets, you're giving that arrow stability. And for us as hunters, we're reducing the amount of control that the broadhead has on the front and increasing the control that the tail and your fletching have on the back. And so, one, it is a benefit for flight. The other part is, dynamically speaking, your flex is changing in that shaft. So if you grab an arrow and you grab it from the ends, it flexes pretty easy. Now put your hands 6 inches apart, try and flex the same shaft. The spine didn't change. The stiffness of that shaft didn't change, but dynamically it's now stiffer. The same thing is happening with that balance point. You're changing where that shaft is moving. And now the front, the short front ahead of that balance point, is going to react stiffer, which helps that impact, really helps on bone impact. And that's where a lot of people get it kind of confused, but the penetration benefits noted in the reports is post bone breach. So there are a lot of benefits to FOC, but specifically for the penetration portion, it's really, if you hit bone, you're going to see a difference after breach in how efficient the arrow went through there, how much energy was lost to flex and to redirection, and what's left to keep penetrating and try and be lethal after you've hit that bone, or to try and exit if it's hitting bone on exit. Does that kind of clear up
Yeah,
FOC for you?
yeah, I think it does, because especially when we talk about one thing that annoys me so much about the arrow debate is everyone always wants to debate penetration specifically, and they want to do it with a foam target. One thing that I really find value in with what you guys do is you are testing on actual animal, actual bone, actual hunting situations. So when you're talking FOC, in my mind, I'm seeing an arrow set up the same way the planes that you referenced were. And I think we neglect the fact that, hey, we can preach all day, perfect shot placement. And I would never disagree with that. As an archer, you should be practicing enough to where when you put your pin on the heart of that animal or wherever it is you decide to shoot, that arrow should go there. I think that in a real hunting situation, how often do you have a deer that stands completely still, doesn't jump a string, doesn't move, doesn't do anything? You don't hit a small limb you didn't see when you were setting up. There's so many other factors that go into this. And so when we're talking FOC, flight stability is obviously super important, but I keep seeing your airplane reference in when that broadhead contacts that animal for the first time and you clip a rib bone, the animal jumps a string, you hit the shoulder, which, guys, it happens. We can keep pretending like these animals don't move, but nobody makes a perfect shot every single time. And when that arrow...
Well, and even if they make a perfect shot, that's the thing, right? You can put that arrow exactly where you wanted. That arrow's path is exactly what you intended, but the animal's now in a new position.
Yeah. That animal does have a vote.
Right? It has a vote. And even in situations where it's a minimal reaction, I can guarantee you if you had film, it didn't hit where that pin was, regardless of if the arrow went to where the pin was.
Right.
And so there's always that variable. And like the thing to keep in mind is an arrow is always flying, whether it's through air, through muscle. It is the way that it's moving, the way that it's traveling is still flight. And so like when you think about stability, to your point, that stability ties into if you hit a twig, right? If you hit some tall grass, whatever you might encounter to the animal. But that stability is the same if you catch a rib, right? If you don't hit it square and you catch the edge and you get a little deviation there, did things just go completely sideways? Or did it kick over and that tail just quickly snap back as best it can?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting to is like when you do, I mean, it's a skeleton. You're more likely than not, anything I've seen in person, there has been bone contacted, whether it was a rib or a shoulder or whatever. There's always seems to be bone somewhere. And so in the FOC part, I just picture that broadhead hitting, clipping even the slightest bone. And then if you have a very, I guess, low FOC, my brain just sees the broadhead hit and then the tail of that arrow flipping around wherever the hell it wants to go. Where does the energy travel at that point? And where does the arrow travel at that point? We're not, it seems like the less FOC you have, the more likely it is to deviate from that straight path through the animal to now you put it right in the ribs and it's going to come out the back ham. Like, I mean, have you guys seen stuff like that happen too?
Oh yeah. I haven't had it happen personally, but I've seen it quite a few times. Yeah. And that's a big part of it is like, we're going to get into this more later, but mass ties directly to inertia. And that's how it's the resistance of something to changing its motion. And so like in the example you just gave, right? If you've got a lot of mass up front and it nicks a rib or nicks a shoulder blade, it's not going to want to deviate path. It wants to go the direction it's going.
Correct.
And it's going to try and maintain that. Now, that might mean that your tail does a really hard snap, right? It's attached. And so if that front deviates and goes, nope, we're doing this, there's going to be a ripple back. But if it's high front of center, you don't have a lot of mass on that back. And that means that it's going to recover and get back in line easier with less energy used. Because if you've got a bunch of mass at the tail, now it has its own inertia once you give it that other motion. And now it wants to keep going whatever direction it's going. And then you get a bunch of flex. And now you've got that flex is now causing your broadhead to point somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it spirals.
Yeah.
So that kind of, I guess, ties in with the second part of your question with the kinetic energy momentum.
Yeah. Before you jump into that, Rob, let me add on that on the FOC. In the case study that we just did, we're going to publish it here soon, as soon as I can finish it and get it proofed. But it's going to go out. But in this test, we did the exact same broadhead, all of them within like 20 grains of each other. And I'm talking about 20 grains. So this isn't going to make any difference. And they're around 1,150 grains total all in weight. And but the only difference was the FOC. One was 15%, another set of arrows was 26%, and another set of arrows was 32%. Guess which arrows did not pass through? The 15%ers. They did not penetrate well at all. And exact same broadhead, everything the same weight, everything. But
flight all clean.
Yeah. So yeah, there's and that's going to be in the case study, so you'll be able to read about it there. And
okay.
But that's just an example of what Rob's talking about.
So this part, guys, it may be boring and it may take you back to like grade school stuff, but before we get into, I guess you can use an arrow as an example, but when we talk kinetic energy, because that is such a hype word that, it is important. Can you just on a basic level just explain how energy works, especially with an arrow? Because I think if we want to talk kinetic energy, we need to understand what kinetic energy actually is and the transfer of energy from, you got your bow, you clip on your release. Transfer of energy as we're drawing. As that arrow is released, we're transferring energy into the air. As the arrow hits the animal, there's energy. And I think in order to fully understand how it relates to bow hunting, we need to understand how energy works to begin with.
Well, and the thing with bow hunting is like energy is part of it, right? But the piece that like everyone, like you mentioned, gets into kinetic energy doesn't matter, or they're pure, that's all that matters. Mm-hmm. Once you choose your bow, your kinetic energy is what it is. Like there's going to be percent variation depending on the arrow setup because of efficiency changes, but we're not talking substantial numbers, right? So once you pick your bow, you're locked in. It is what it is at that point. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, like, for us, we go, it's not a great reference number because unless you change bows, you're not going to see any difference in that number.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But as far as what that number is, so to your point, you draw your bow back. That is, you are using kinetic energy and then storing it in the bow. So mm-hmm. your motion, kinetic is motion. Mm-hmm. You're moving, adding energy, and it's being stored in the limbs of the bow. And your cams are applying mechanical advantage and all that, right?
Yep.
And when you release, now that potential energy in the bow is being transferred back into kinetic energy in the arrow. At that point, it is what it is. So if you've got a 40-pound bow or an 80-pound bow, I mean, that number is what it is. More is obviously more total penetration potential, right? If everything is the same, if the arrow's the same, you've got an infinitely long target that can just measure as much penetration as possible, right? If everything else stays the same, the more kinetic energy you have, the more penetration you're going to have. But we don't have the ability to really change that number.
Yeah.
So as someone that, okay, I've got my bow, now I'm trying to figure out what arrow is going to work best for me. And I'm trying to be, I guess, data driven and actually evaluate what the differences are. At that point, kinetic energy doesn't do me any good.
And that's
now
what
I need a new reference.
Right. And that's one thing I wanted to kind of clear up, because it seems like people think that the lighter your arrow is, the more kinetic energy you're going to get. And like you were explaining, that's not how energy works. The lighter arrow does, you don't have like a 650 grain arrow has, and I don't know what percentages we want to talk about, but let's just say 50%. And then you drop to a 300 grain and all of a sudden you've got 95% kinetic. Like, so that's why I wanted to kind of, on a very basic level, it's boring.
It's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
So the lightest arrow that you shoot out of your bow will be the least efficient.
Yeah.
At transfer. And this is, so that transfer is the duration of your string going from full draw to the stop, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a set distance based on your draw length. Now, that time frame from full draw to stop is all the time that the bow has to transfer all of its stored energy somewhere.
Yeah.
And the lighter the arrow, the faster it's going to be, which means the less time it's going to spend on the string, which means less time for transfer. And so, like, if you look at a bow at IBO spec, 70, 30, 350 grain arrow, that's where all the bows are pretty much rated, right?
Right. Yep.
That is your base. And like that testing is 5 grains per pound. Majority of manufacturers say don't shoot any less than that. The reason that you don't go below 5 grains per pound, it's a safety factor, because if you get too far below that point, you'll be too inefficient and you're going to damage the bow, because any remaining energy in the bow stays in the bow and is now vibration, and it's going, that energy is going to be used somewhere in the bow.
Yeah.
And so that's where you see guys that, bend cams, blow limbs, stuff like that, when they're going way too light.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so all of that energy is being used as you go heavier. And this isn't like you have to hit a certain point. It's just increase your arrow weight. The bow is going to slowly get more efficient, and it's going to slow down. But your kinetic energy number, if you have an accurate enough way of testing it, will continue increasing until you have reached peak efficiency, which is, from my testing, well beyond where anyone would actually go for hunting. That's, I mean, I think the last low poundage test that I did was with a 40-pound bow, and I went from 5 grains per pound up to 25 grains per pound, which for any 60 or 70-pound bow shooter, that'd be like a 3,500 grain arrow. Jeez. Right? Equivocally.
Yeah.
And the kinetic energy, once I got around I think it was 15 grains per pound, the rate of growth slowed down pretty drastically, but it was still increasing. And at some point you would reach a theoretical peak where your mechanical losses are what they are. You're going to have friction in the bearings. You're going to have all of that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't eliminate that. And so there is a theoretical peak efficiency.
Mhm.
But that's why when guys shoot heavier arrows, they start noticing that, hey, my bow's quieter.
Yeah.
It doesn't have as much hand shock. Like it feels smoother.
Mhm.
It's because there's less energy left in the bow.
Yeah.
It's all in the arrow.
One thing I want to add in that, and this is going to probably blow a lot of people's minds that listen to this, kinetic energy nor momentum are predictors of penetration into an animal.
Yeah.
Really?
Correct.
Yeah.
People want to hype that, but it's not. It is
Yeah,
not.
Well, and that's where they're not directly, it's not a direct correlation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
reference things and go, it'll have more as long as everything else is the same, but by itself, it's nothing.
Yeah.
So speaking to that, I mean, that's a really interesting comment, because I mean, as you guys are aware, like in the arrow world, I think the three of the most brought up terms are FOC, kinetic energy, and momentum.
Yeah.
And I mean, specifically when we're talking penetration, and people use each one of those different factors to say this is why this type of arrow penetrates better. So with that, I mean, that deviates from my question, but I think that really needs to be talked about. Can you kind of expand on that comment?
Yes. I've got two very good examples for everybody. One lady shooting a 48-pound recurve. We built her the right arrow systems, a full 12-factor penetration enhancing arrow system. And we all know that a 48-pound recurve is generating probably a whopping 30 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, 35 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. Okay, let's just say 40 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. It's a super efficient recurve. She not only killed a Cape buffalo with her bow, but she killed a giraffe with her bow. Okay. But she was using the right arrow systems. I've got another lady that uses a 50-pound compound, and probably in the 50, 60 foot-pounds of kinetic energy range, because it's a more efficient modern compound. Right arrow system, also killed a Cape buffalo cleanly. All of these are one arrow kills. So yeah, the people get caught up on, I've got X number of kinetic energy, X number of momentum, but then they don't look at their arrow systems. They use an inefficient broadhead, inefficient arrow system. And it really starts with the broadhead. If you're using an inefficient broadhead, that's the first thing that makes contact with that animal. And if it takes exponentially more force to get through that hair and hide, meat, bones, the chances of you getting into that thoracic cavity to kill that animal are limited. And we actually, and again, in the case studies, we've got this year's case study that will be published soon. It will be, it will show we've got 1,100 something grain arrows. I mean, all the numbers look great. I mean, the kinetic energy, the momentum, over 100 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, over a slug feet of momentum. And the numbers sound great, but they didn't penetrate 5 inches because of an inefficient broadhead system on the front. So that's what I mean by, you can't use solely kinetic energy and momentum as a predictor of your penetration.
Yeah.
So would you say that, putting all the rest of the 12 factors aside, putting aside all the buzzwords related to arrow efficiency and lethality, broadhead choice is kind of like, does that kind of trump everything in a way? Like, it seems like if
Not
you have
everything, right?
No.
It's so, and this is kind of getting into the factors a bit, but
and feel free to do that.
It's a system. Yeah. It's a system. It all needs to play together, right? And if you change one thing, it's going to impact other areas. It's going to have ripple effects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, the only two hard and fast requirements, I will use the word requirement, is it has to be structurally sound, right? Stuff breaking means no penetration.
Right.
And it has to fly perfect. That's it. If you don't have those two, it can be the best looking system on paper. It could be 1,000 grains. It could have a 3-to-1 broadhead. It could have 30% FOC. It could be hit all of the factors. Be theoretically the best performing thing that you could ever build. If it breaks, it ain't doing a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't break, if it's not flying cleanly, it's not going to do a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's where it all plays together. Like, broadheads, to your point, are a big part of it. Broadheads cover close to half of the factors, right? Mechanical advantage, edge retention, the ferrule, how the ferrule tapers to the blade, you know, the overall silhouette, on and on.
Yeah.
All of those are aspects of a broadhead design and how it's going to impact your performance. So that is definitely a huge part of it. And that's where, like, with the kinetic energy momentum, like, it's all, I guess, word choice is really important, right? Because, like, for just, you know, you personally, whatever your setup is, whatever your bow is, if you leave that all the same and you go, I'm going to increase my arrow mass, which will then, my kinetic energy will be essentially the same. My momentum value will go up. Now you can look at that and go, I increased my mass. I have more momentum. That if broadhead's the same, everything else is the same, flight is the same, the heavier, higher momentum arrow should perform better, right? And that's where, for that system, you increase the momentum, everything else is the same, it should perform better than the lighter version of itself, right? But that's a very select comparison. When you start going, well, my arrow has, you know, 0.6 slugs momentum, your arrow only has 0.5, mine's going to do better. Like, that's not even close to a really valid statement, because there's so many other variables. Like,
Yeah.
and that's where Rob was getting at, is you have guys, I mean, browse Facebook, browse archery talk. You're going to see guys that are failing to penetrate whitetail.
Yeah.
They're failing to penetrate pigs. And they're shooting 70, 80 pound modern compounds that, even with a light arrow, say a 400 grain arrow, they're going to be at 0.5, 0.6 slugs of momentum. That's, like, if you look in the reports, and this is where people, like, hone in on, like, numbers and go, oh, well, that's what I want to aim for. I've already got that. Okay, you've got that piece, right? But it's like, just because you're at that momentum level doesn't mean that it's going to work, right? And that's where, like, those guys, they might have more momentum. They definitely have more kinetic energy, and they're struggling on whitetail. But yet the women that Rob mentioned, or like my wife or one of our ambassadors, Alex, they're on the other end of the spectrum, short draw, low poundage, and that means that they're going to have less kinetic energy, less momentum, and they're killing stuff left and right. And so it's one where you can't just hand pick one thing.
Yeah.
It's a system. And I mean, it really ties into, like, at the start of this, what's the foundation about? We want to decrease the wounded loss rate, which means that we want to improve everyone's lethality. And that's not anti anything, right? It's pro lethality.
Mm-hmm.
We're just following the data.
Right.
That's all that we're doing. Is like, people say that, to your point, people say that we're, anti below 650 or anti this or anti that.
No.
Not necessarily.
No. Mechanicals is one of them. And in our test this year in June, we finally had a mechanical that held together. Not only, I was so surprised, we tested it at 610 grains total all in weight. It performed really well. The other mechanicals, we had 3 sets of mechanicals in it. 2 of them did what I expected they would do. Honestly, I thought all 3 of them were just going to blow apart.
Mm-hmm.
But one actually held together real well. And I was like, okay, well, since it held together this well, let's test it again. So we ran it, we pulled some other arrows and we reset them up on 900 grains and shot them off of an 82-pound bow. And they still held up well. One had just a slight bend in its blade. And that was honestly the surprise of the test. Structurally, it actually held up better than some of the premium products
Mm-hmm.
that are sold specifically for hunting big, large, dangerous game. So it's like, does that mean I'm going to recommend that head? No, but I'm going to basically say, if you've got to shoot a mechanical, you might want to look at this head because it held up during this test, and everything that I've seen and heard about this head since then being utilized, it's performed very well.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's one where it's data, right?
Yeah, it's data.
So it performed well. That's going to be in the report.
Yeah.
Right. At least it performed well in that category.
Yeah.
And so we'll have that noted. And that's another one. Everyone's like, oh, you're anti-mechanical. No, we just haven't had any that had good results.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll follow the data.
Yeah.
If it deviates from where we have it kind of projected, we're going to follow that. We're going to go, okay, like the data is pointing this way. Let's keep chasing. Let's keep following it.
Yeah.
Do I think it's going to deviate significantly? No, just because of the volume of data that's been collected and everything else. But that's all it is.
Yeah. And that's one thing I've heard you guys talk about before on, people want to assume that you guys are anti-mechanical broadhead, but I think the fact of the matter is you guys, with what you're testing, haven't been able to get to the rest of your data points because the broadhead has not stayed intact, or it didn't make it through. So at that point, like you were saying earlier, we can follow until it fails, and then we can't go any further. If it fails, it failed. Yeah. So I think that's where people think, oh, you're anti-mechanical, and you're like, no, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but it's like, if we could get a mechanical broadhead to get through the testing, we'd love to test all the way through on it. But they don't tend to get through the testing so that we can actually put data together on it. Is that kind of accurate?
The one we just tested that held together, yes. I mean, so it's going to be in the reports. The rest, the others are going to be in the reports too as failures because they blow apart. And then I just impromptu, we set up a light and fast arrow because there's a lot of people out there that go, oh, my light and fast arrow, my 450 grain arrow is going to penetrate as much as these 650 grain arrows, with 450 with a mechanical. So of course I did that test, and it exploded on impact. So, but it's granted, running into the side of a Cape Buffalo, you're running into a 1.5 inch thick rib too.
Right.
So.
And that's kind of a topic, just to bring it back home for particularly my listeners. A lot of us aren't hunting African game. A lot of us are going to be hunting white-tailed deer. What have you guys seen on deer in specific, or smaller, medium game animals, in terms of like mechanical broadheads versus fixed broadheads? Do mechanicals tend to, in your testing, still blow up the way that, like, what's causing them to blow up on these animals? But I guess how to look at it from like a deer hunter's perspective, Are they as bad in the realm of deer hunting as they seem to be on African game?
I think the reason they're basically any of these 100 grain heads, you look at a 100 grain head, that is I mean, you've got minimal material there, 100 and 125 grain heads. You've just got a minimal amount of material there. So, and then you put all the velocity of the modern bows behind that, and you have any weight whatsoever behind that in the air shaft, something's going to give. And the stuff with the lightest material out there, the minimal material out there, it's not going to hold up. So I think that's when you start looking at the blades and the blade design, they're just little bitty flimsy blades, and they're not and I'll say this: when a mechanical works, they're devastating. When they don't work, they're also devastating. So I mean, it's that's the problem, is there's so many failures of these broadheads across the spectrum of bow hunters. And I look at it from, okay, it's just a lack of material up there. And then when you do limit it down to 100 grains and you're trying to have the blades that's fold out and everything, the lack of mechanical advantage, I mean, it's going in basically like a hatchet trying to cut through, and they're just less efficient, and they're running into harder objects than foam or gel. And so there's your problem right there. So I think that's the biggest problem right there. People don't realize it, how light 100 grains actually is. So,
and that's a big, I guess, part of it is the quality of the material in a lot of those heads is lacking. So then you've got lacking quality in a very light, thin package. I mean, just looking at blade thickness, you compare the vast majority of mechanicals, it's essentially razor blade. I mean, they're thin. And then you look at some of your more durable fixed blades, and those are small knives.
Right.
Like there's some heft to them. There's blade thickness. If I take that in my hand, I can't bend it just with my fingers. Right. So just from a very simplistic standpoint, you can tell very quickly, just holding and playing with a broadhead, if it's going to be relatively durable or not. Right. And as far as like African game compared to like whitetail, it's not as far off as a lot of people think. And the reason I say that is, like, the testing that we've done, the testing that we continue to do, is not looking at best case scenario. We're intentionally using those game because it pretty much guarantees us bone impact, which is where most people struggle, right? People don't struggle when they make a clean hit on a whitetail. They struggle when it turns and they catch the shoulder. They struggle when it's a poor shot. And I guess the thought is that even if it's a poor shot, or if it hits in an undesirable location, if it's in line with the vitals, it's still lethal as long as it continues penetrating. Right. And so that's then the goal, is how do we continue to penetrate? And so, like Rob just mentioned, that a lot of the Cape Buffalo ribs are around like a 1/2 inch thick. How thick is the scapular rib on a whitetail? How heavy is the shoulder socket? Right. And where do most bone impacts occur on a whitetail? That front shoulder, base of the scapula. Right. So now you're going, okay, yeah, it's a very different size animal, but the piece that I'm concerned about, the piece that gives people problems, is relatively similar to what we're testing. And we're using what we use for test because of the consistency.
Just real quick, I want to point out, sorry to interrupt, but a Cape Buffalo's ribs, for your listeners, they're not only about a half inch thick, they're flat and they overlap. So when you shoot, you are going to hit bone. So then that's another reason we use the Cape Buffalo for our test medium.
Well, yeah, I mean, you think about the cost of testing and the time involved, and like you get the animal on the ground, we've got a very short window to do the testing. And once that clock runs out, you're done. It don't matter if you had another 10 arrows that you wanted to test. The clock's the end.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, you don't want to be wasting shots. You want every shot to be usable data, and that gives us it, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, we're 100% nonprofit. All of it's out of our pockets, and from the donations of people that support us. So we want to make the most of those funds, and that's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing I want to touch on too, just for validity reasons, is you guys don't take donations from anybody or any company or anyone like that who might want to influence a spin on a test or anything like that. You guys
Correct.
are getting donations from just individual people. You guys are buying basically off the shelf stuff. Like you're not contacting Rage broadheads or Iron Will broadheads or any of the other cutthroats or whatever it might be. You're not going out and saying, hey guys, we want to test your broadhead. You guys are just kind of doing everything behind the scenes so you get what we get.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. And that's where, like, we either, like, Rob, you have utilized, one of the shops that we're close with to do some bulk orders of things.
Yeah.
But otherwise it's a personal order. We're going on the website just like anyone else would, putting an order in, and no one in most cases is the wiser as to who we are or, what that broadhead's being purchased for.
Yeah.
Which means there's no hand selecting. There's
Right.
no making sure that, this one needs to be like, don't go from that batch. Like make sure to give them these ones. Like,
Right.
So that really allows us to be truthful and be honest in what the typical person's gonna see. When we test sharpness, when we look at all those things, that's like, if it says hunt ready, we're testing it out of the package.
Yeah.
Right.
I had some that were hunt ready that were over 1,000 grams of pressure on my test medium, on my best sharpness tester. And I was just like, I've got butter knives that are sharper than that. I mean, they were horrible. And we did actually there was an improvement we made from the 2021 test to this year's test, was what Rob just touched on, was we basically, instead of, to eliminate the hand selection, we basically use third parties to get our broadheads for us. So it's just like anybody else getting a broadhead out there, no hand selection. And we have already seen a difference. We immediately saw a difference out of the box from 2021 to 2022 testing on some sharpness of broadheads.
Really?
And so, yes. And so, yeah, but I think that's just the way I've got to do it from now on, because the people know what we're doing with their stuff. And if I buy it and they know where it's going, then they're going to, of course they're going to hand select it for us. And some may not, some may. So I can't prove that. Just, speculation. So, but the differences we saw from the 2021 to 2022 were quite eye-opening.
Yeah.
So,
and one of the biggest things I hear too, when we're talking specifically the testing that you guys do, that I want to clear up as well, you always hear they're shooting these heavy arrows, they're shooting African game, and they're shooting them with traditional bows. You guys are doing testing with modern compounds correct?
Correct.
I mean, so when they say all of that, the 12 factors that Ashby studies, that's great for traditional bows. It doesn't mean anything for modern compound bows, because you hear that a lot. The truth of the matter is that you guys are using modern compound bows. You are testing on the equipment that we are using in the woods currently.
Correct. And even Doc used compound bows in his testing. So again, reading comprehension issues, selective reading, whatever you want to call it, incompetence, whatever. So people select what they want to see and read. They just see parts of it. They don't see the whole picture. But no, Doc was actually using the Martin compound bows in his testing for the Natal study. So they were involved in. So and honestly, the arrow, and you can't get this through people's heads. The arrow doesn't care whether it's a recurve, longbow, compound, crossbow. It doesn't care what shoots it.
Right.
It's still flying.
It's gonna fly.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's a big piece of it, because like in some of the testing that Doc did, right, as he was refining the systems and as he was continuing further and further down the path of improvement, he needed to keep the broadhead inside of the animal in order to have usable data. And that's not saying that it would even be a pass-through. It's the difference between the broadhead staying inside the animal, where it is 100% measurable with no change compared to the other shots, or the broadhead poking out, and now there's all I can do is measure to the animal. And so now it's not valid data because it left. Now there's a change. And so that's part of what he did, is as he continued refining, he started stepping down in bows in order to ensure, and this goes back to the cost and time involved, and going, not every shot, and that's like our testing this year, right? 80-pound compound, different levels of arrow builds, and there were shots that had, what, I think you had mentioned like 5-6 inches.
Yeah.
And then there was other ones that did pass through.
Yeah.
So it's even at that point, you're not looking at like 100% pass throughs. But if even a shot goes through and it's not usable, that's wasted time and wasted resources. And so he was stepping things back in order to guarantee that it was money well spent.
Yeah.
And that's where, I mean, there's been testing with even crossbows. And like, it's funny because a lot of people don't, and we've kind of went the long way around, but we still haven't like talked specifically on momentum that and mass, like we initially were kind of talking. But the other piece of that is speed. When you look at resistance, speed is a huge factor in how much resistance is encountered. So in the equation, it's squared. And so if you have, say, a longbow that is shooting something at 130 feet per second, or say 150 feet per second, and then you've got a compound shooting a different arrow at 300 feet per second, the resistance encountered by that 300 foot per second arrow, it's double the speed. It's going to be 4 times the resistance. So that's another variable there, right? So it's one where, I mean, even in our testing, I think it was the 2018 update, we made a comment that we were seeing more consistency in the lower poundage bows than the 80-pound bows on these big animals, which seems counterintuitive.
Right.
Right. But there's other factors at play. The level of impact resistance changes how much the shaft is flexing, changes how small deviations and small details filter down the shaft and how it flexes, and then what the resistance there is, and it all plays together.
Yeah.
And so that's where, again, back to like the momentum, it's not purely about that number, right? The momentum, and I don't think we ever clarified what momentum was. We talked about kinetic energy.
Right.
Momentum is your force. So I can have whatever the potential is out of the given kinetic energy, but that kinetic energy it's energy. It's in all directions. It's the heat being generated from the friction of whatever it's passing through, air or animal, whatever. It's the noise, the vibrations, it's all of it. Momentum is directional. So it is X force in this specific direction. And so that's a little bit more usable than the kinetic energy value. And it kind of ties back to the kinetic energy value. Once you pick your bow, it's pretty much set. The momentum, as you change your arrow weight and the bow stays the same, as the weight goes up, the momentum is going to increase. So you're going to have a reference point that you can go, oh, I changed the weight by this much and I saw a 10 or 20 or whatever percent increase in my initial force.
And is that broadhead contacting animal, or is that off the bow? Are you talking?
So and that's why I said initial force, because most people are looking at launch speed.
Right.
Right. And so that's where I know you didn't mention this term, but I'm gonna deviate slightly into mass and inertia. Because this is the driving force behind why you want a heavier arrow. And like with the whole like argument, I don't say heavy arrow. I say heavier.
Right.
Because if wherever you are currently, if you go heavier, you're going to increase your force, but you're also going to have more inertia. And that inertia is what sustains that force, right? You think about if you've got a dump truck barreling down the highway and then you've got a sport bike. If both of those hit a wall, which one is going to maintain speed?
Yeah.
The heavy one.
Right.
Right. And it's not because it was going faster. It could be going much slower. It's going to keep moving because the inertia of that mass is going, I'm not going to change. The more mass you have, the less it's going to want to change. And so that then translates to your impact speed and your impact kinetic energy, your impact momentum. And Troy Ranch Fairy has actually some good videos on that topic, looking at downrange speed of different setups. And it can be eye-opening, because you can have drastically different numbers at 20, 40, 60 yards downrange than what you think. And the heavier that you go, the less it changes. So like the last time as I did a round of lab radar testing, probably 6 years ago. And the majority of arrows that I looked at in the 350 to 400 grain range, in 20 yards, we're losing minimum of like 15 feet per second.
Really?
My 900 grain arrows that I was testing were losing like 1 or 2.
See, I'm glad you brought this up because this is the faster arrow, faster arrow, faster arrow, and I'm gonna have you keep going on it.
Yeah.
When you get out to 60 yards, or let's just say 40 to 50, you know, kind of if everything is perfect with the setup as far as from bow to animal, that you're willing to take a 45-yard shot on a deer. Everyone says, well, I want the fast arrow because when that thing releases from the bow, we know that the deer is going to jump it. So I want that arrow to get there as fast as possible. And I think that at first glance, that makes sense. Why would you want an arrow traveling 200 feet per second because it's heavy? You would want the 305 feet per second arrow because it's going to hit that animal quicker. But this is where I'll have you take that over because I think this is where things get kind of interesting.
So it's interesting because, again, this is all multifaceted, right? So my first piece of that is tying back to the bow efficiency and the noise that your bow is making, and then the noise that the arrow is making. So as that arrow gets heavier, the noise from your bow is going to decrease. And I guess the testing that I've done on it with like an actual decibel meter, it's not a significant change in decibels, but the tone, the frequency does change. And if you think about sounds in nature, you don't have many like sharp sounds, right? Lower frequency thuds and bumps and stuff like that is more natural, less startling, I'll say.
Right.
And so that's one piece that a lot of people don't consider is I can shoot a heavy arrow and it's going to be more of a thump sound instead of a crack or a snap. So that can play slightly into the types of reactions that you even get. But then downrange, it's, I guess, depending on how wide of a, variable you're looking at, right? The wider the variable, the more difference you're going to have downrange. And it's not like the light arrow. I mean, it's going to take a lot for the light arrow to have a slower impact speed than the heavy one. That's not a realistic comparison. But the piece that a lot of people don't think about is the momentum. And this is where, like, we tend to say that momentum is not created equal, right? And it's kind of a questionable statement because momentum is momentum. But what we're trying to infer with that is the inertia aspect of it. Because if you look at the equation, it's speed, velocity, times the mass. So if your force is heavily dependent on the speed and you lose, say, 20 feet per second, what's that do to your force? Whereas if you've got a really heavy arrow that isn't really losing speed, now what's your force?
Right.
And so that's where the consistency and the maintaining of force becomes more of the kind of key factor. And we're simply talking about air resistance right now, right? We haven't even got into the actual push.
Right.
We're just going A to B, going through the air. You're seeing this change. So now what happens at impact? Now you have to actually penetrate something.
Right.
Your resistance just went from this, right? Just moving through air to now you're trying to push through hair, hide, muscle, bone. So how fast do you think those two are going to separate now?
Right.
And what's the forces going to look like? And that's where you can have two arrows that are similar momentum values, right? To Rob's point early on, you can have similar momentum values, but if the mass is drastically different, the heavy one's going to keep pushing.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're actually getting where you wanted to go. The other fun part, and Rob, I don't know if you might want to speak on this one a little more, is tied to your flight path and your pins or your tape.
Yeah. I mean, my pins, my whole system right now, it's a 70-pound compound, and I shoot a 660 grain all in arrow system. 25% FOC, but it's structurally sound. I got perfect flight, and then everything else falls in behind that. But my pin gap, when you compare it to a lighter setup, it's really not that far off from the difference in pin gap. When you compare them side, you can take them, put them side by side, and I can take a guy's with a 450 to 500 grain arrow system in mine, and they are very same poundage, same everything. The pin gaps are very close. My wife uses a single pin with the tapes and everything, but it's really, that's a personal preference of single pin versus a multi-pin. And I use a multi-pin because I've used it my whole life. I'm used to seeing it, and I'm able to just go, okay, this animal click, it's 35 yards. There's my 30-yard pin, come up a little bit, split the gap between, put my where 35 would be on its heart. Or in the magic triangle to penetrate through that magic triangle, and then smooth release. So yeah, the interesting thing, and going back to what Troy did on his charts, and they're out there online, they're out on YouTube. You can find the charts. And I might have the numbers slightly off, but there was like a 380 something grain arrow, and then there was like a 500 grain arrow. The interesting thing on that chart, due to the speed erosion of that lighter arrow, the momentum of that arrow, that 380 something grain arrow at launch, was less than the 500 grain arrow was carrying at 60 yards.
Really?
Yes. And that's off of lab radar. All this was done off of lab radar. He and Daryl did this and plugged it out there. So it's quite an interesting, the resistance of the higher speed arrows and the air, just the air alone, like Rob touched on, slowing that arrow down. And that hadn't even gotten to an animal at that point in time. So what do you have left? You're losing it quick. And I think that helps when people don't look at it in that detail, and they're thinking, okay, I've got to use this light, fast arrow. I've got to use the mechanical broadhead because it flies the same as my field point. That tells, and that's another topic, but that definitely helps increase the wound loss rates when you're using those super light, fast arrows, and then you've got the speed dump out at range, and they're wanting to launch these things at 50, 60, 70 yards. And I always tell these guys that, I've hunted out west, and I've got guys that are going out west. They're like, I need to go to this light fast setup because I've got to shoot 80, 90, 100 yards. I'm like, and this dives into something else, but I always tell those guys, my secret for your success at shooting at those distances is to learn how to bow hunt, get close. Archery is not about shooting at 80, 90, 100 yards. I practice at 80 yards. I have no problem shooting my 660 grain arrows at 80 yards at all. Yeah. And I practice that far. Do I want that to be my first shot? No. Will I make that shot if I make a bad shot at the animal reacts? I make a bad shot and he's standing out there. Yes, I can. So, but no, that would not be my first shot. Anyhow, but the mechanical side of things, when people tell me that, I've got to shoot a mechanical because it flies the same as my field point, that tells me something between the arrow, the bow, or the Indian is not lined up.
Mm-hmm.
So then usually a lot of the times it's the Indian, but a lot of the times you've got a mismatched arrow to the bow, and they're not tuned. And I think a common misconception is a lot of these bow shops, they go to a bow shop, they get their bow, and they're like, oh, I'm good to go. The bow shop set it up for me. I'm ready to go. That's